This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
When you think about your future, you know what calls to you. Meaningful work, happiness, growth, and sharing these values with others. But how will you find all of that? There are many paths forward, including one you may not have considered. The military provides countless opportunities to pursue your calling, where you can be part of something bigger than yourself, while still being yourself, and having the future you want. You have a calling, we have an answer. Learn more at todaysmilitary.com.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a very special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. It's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, development stories, release stories. All those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to talk about on this podcast, they're more towards the mainstream than anything else, really. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of the movies and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get them made. What you've happened upon here is one of my occasional special episodes of the podcast where I bring in someone associated with the world of films, talk about their latest release and stroke or their body of work. In this case, both. I'm delighted to be joined by the brilliant actor Fiona Shaw, who's one of the ensemble cast for director John Krasinski's new film, If, which is PG rated, not U rated, as I talk about in the conversation coming up. Fiona Shaw's acting work, I don't even know how to begin to encapsulate it. As you'll hear at the start of the conversation, I can't go, just for time reasons, I don't really go near her extensive theatre credits and her work with theatre director Deborah Warner. We touch also very, very briefly on the recent True Detective series, Night Country. I talk very briefly about her work in the TV series True Blood as well. And just to set it up, there's a couple of films that are mentioned. We talk about Three Men and a Little Lady, for instance, which dates all the way back to the early 1990s. Towards the end of the conversation, she also talks about her work with Terrence Malick on The Tree of Life and on Brian De Palma as well on the film The Black Dahlia. And so we get brief snippets of that, as well as conversations about 1993 Super Mario Brothers movie, 1987's The Avengers film as well, and a whole lot more as well. I found her a really, really fascinating person to talk to. I hope you enjoy the conversation as well. I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer for If, and you'll hear my conversation with Fiona Shaw, the other side of this.
What if I told you imaginary friends are real? And when their kids grow up, they're forgotten.
Are any of them scary?
Worse. Desperate.
Question, why did these kids forget about us in the first place?
Last week I just started falling apart. You're sucking the oxygen out of the room.
Honestly, Doc, if this is how it's going to be, I'm just going to wheel myself back and plug in.
We've started a matchmaking agency to help IFs find new kids.
Or we just disappear.
Blue. Happy place.
Oh, coffee and croissants.
I can help you.
How?
'Cause I'm a kid.
You are the chosen one. No. Let's not give her a complex.
Good luck, short stack.
It's all up to you.
No pressure.
Hook and dagger!
That was a clip from If, and I am delighted to be joined for this Film Story special podcast by Fiona Shaw CBE. I mean, first of all, thank you so much. I respect your CBE. You're laughing at me. It's just like, you got it, I didn't. So a big welcome to this podcast, first and foremost. How do we find you, Fiona Shaw CBE?
You find me actually in a most unusual situation. Is I'm in a hotel. Now I live in London, but I'm in a hotel in London because my boiler broke. So we're here to be, we're going through the process of opening the film today. So I stayed in the hotel, and it's unusual to stay in a hotel in the city in which you live, but I'm actually homesick.
Okay. You'll be doing the open top bus tour of London, Nick.
Yes,
I wish best wishes to your boiler. I mean, that's yeah.
Yeah, welcome to my world.
I feel like such a heathen already talking to you, because this is a film podcast. So straight away, I'm going nowhere near your incredible theatre work, all the work you've done with Deborah Warner, all that wonderful stuff. So I want to acknowledge it up front. And I've also, just before you came on, there's two things I've just been looking at. One was a lovely interview you did in 2012 about True Blood. And halfway through the interview, you called out the interviewer in a very polite way for asking their stupid question. So I ask of you, when I hit my stupid question, will you give me a secret signal? That would be, I thought that was great. I'm all for this.
Very unlike me. I was brought up to be more polite than that.
No, it wasn't nasty. I thought it was hilarious. And certainly, deep in your list of credits, you've got all this amazing work you've done on screen, and then there's a music video for Robert Palmer and the song "Riding High." And I've just been watching this on this screen. How did you end up in that? If you don't mind me, I'll get to the film in a second. I was just like, I'm watching it. It looks absolutely exhausting. Is this a mystery to you?
Mystery to me.
Okay, I will send you that. I'll send you that. Let's see how that works. First of all, then, can I start with the film we're here to talk about? Because it's a good idea. Yeah. I am a parent who finds live action family movies a little bit of an endangered species at the moment. I see lots of brilliant work in animation, but actually human beings in front of a camera in a PG certificate film I can take my children to see. I think that's something to cherish. Can I ask then, from your perspective, how you got that? It's the obvious question, how you got involved with this and working with John Krasinski, really, who is a very delightful and bearded man in my experience.
He's very bearded and very delightful. And he came to London, and I got a message saying, will you come and have dinner with Phoebe and me at Phoebe's house? And I thought, why would I want him to? So I went up to see Phoebe and him, and we had a wonderful night sitting out in the garden on a big table. And he talked us both through this film idea he had. And he was determined to have us both. It was like he said, I've written it for you. I thought, written it for us, it'd be ridiculous. But he had. And so by the end of the evening, we were both on, but we hadn't read the script or anything. And then he was very, very guarded about the script. And I read the script. Of course, it's breathtaking to read the script because of what happens in the middle of the film, particularly when the child meets these imaginary friends and that they're all unemployed. I mean, it's a wonderful idea that they're unemployed. I think it's such a good idea. I mean, you could do the same thing if you were a Catholic about guardian angels, couldn't you? All the guardian angels who suddenly kind of run out of steam when somebody sins or something. But anyway, he wrote it, he says, for his children and then for the people he wanted to have in it. So we had said yes in advance of reading any script. So that's how I got involved with it. It's not really, it didn't take any thinking.
So Phoebe, presumably being Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Correct.
You mentioned that. And when I first heard of this film, it was 2019. That's when I first got some kind of wind that it was actually going to happen. And all we got back then was it was about imaginary friends. Was it roughly around the same time that it came into your life then? Was it a kind of film you had to stick around for?
I didn't have to stick around for it. I got it. The pandemic blocks everything's calendar-wise, doesn't it? I feel it was about 3 years ago he asked me to do it. Would that be after the pandemic?
That's 2021. Yeah, just happened.
Maybe. So he must have had it growling around in his head. I asked him how he wrote it, and he said he wrote it going running or walking. So I'd asked him how he'd done. He then sent me A Quiet Place, which I was so scared to watch. I watched it in the middle of the day, and I thought it was brilliantly invented, because
Yeah.
you can see that his talent is really structure, that he really understands how to structure something so that you are, it's greater than the sum of its parts. And I think the same thing about If is that it's, the idea is simple but excellent, but he has expanded it beautifully. And he did the same with The Quiet Place. So I was very taken with John's work. I felt he was, unnecessarily auditioning himself for us. But anyway, we did that. And then they set a date and it was moved. Yes, it was going to be done in the spring, and then it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was moved to the autumn, which was just lucky, because it's hard to get things to fit in. But we did it then.
Yeah, I mean, I asked the question just because I know lots of films that started before 2020, and casting at the best of times seems very fluid to me as a heathen on the outside of the film industry. But even more so, the number of films where actors couldn't stick around for that particular film, or did move on. But that was never really a question in this one. It's just like once you're
Well,
in,
it
you're in.
probably was. I mean, if he'd made it in that summer,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to do it. Or if he made it in the January, I was doing Night Country, so I wouldn't have. So it fitted well that autumn. Yeah.
I love you. I love the fact you just drop in the True Detective series there. What a response that had as well.
That was a great.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. You've also said, I mean, I went through some of the material sent over this film. You've also
Red,
said,
you've also said, I hate you've also said, because
excellent. Oh, what?
A, not remember it, and
Lovely.
B, should I have said?
Well, no, you just made the observation that you think John Krasinski is brilliant at writing about families, and I thought that was quite interesting. Because I talked to John Krasinski about this film. And there's a film that's very personal and cherishable to me called Parenthood from 1989, which is one of the few films I've seen that's taken the health and the mental health of teenagers and youngsters seriously, but using a little bit of humor as well to kind of break down some of those boundaries. And I think cinema's really powerful for this when you're not necessarily expecting it. I'm just wondering what you took from the writing and the importance of family just in the midst of it.
Well, I think John will talk to you again about that, I'm sure, but he does talk about family a lot. He and Emily and I had breakfast one morning in London in another hotel, and we talked a lot about our upbringings. He was brought up in Boston, of course, and Catholic,
Yeah.
Irish, Polish family, and she was talking about her family. So, he's very preoccupied with family, and then he has now 2 children of his own, and they have a very strong family life in New York. I know that because we had to finish shooting at Halloween early that day, because he wanted to get home to do the Halloween
I love that.
masks and apple bobbing. So he both relishes and revels in his family life, I think, in that way. And in that way, he's very much part of the American tradition that isn't a tradition, I think, particularly here, of wanting to be a big kid. I mean, he is sort of a big kid. And he was
Yeah.
very funny when filming, because he was always playing all of those animals, all those creatures with us. So he's very playful. But what is, amazing is underneath it is he's got his head screwed on.
I remember reading in Alan Rickman's diaries about making the Harry Potter films and about the drive a lot of the time, to his frustration, I think, I'm not putting his words in his mouth, but to his frustration that a lot of the time it's on very effects heavy films, it's about getting the shots. And the shots are not giving actors necessarily as much space as they'd want to get performance. Again, I can't say that's definite. That's just what I kind of took from his diaries. In the case of If, what I'm hearing is, again, what you were saying about John Krasinski being a big kid, and also the fact that he was so invested on the set in kind of recreating as much of this for real and giving you space. Was there a real sense of that? Because I'm just conscious you've done quite a lot now of effects-driven family movies, and I just wonder how it sort of compares, really.
Yes, I mean, Alan, I think, yeah, I mean, I think Alan had a very difficult time on Harry Potter because, you know, he
Yeah.
was usually acting with 1,000 children. I think that's quite hard work because everything has to be very, very formal. You know, he and Maggie
Yeah.
Smith had to sit up at the top table, and I'm sure, you know, it took ages to get the camera to come round, and the food was rotting on the tables, and God knows what else. Whereas, you know, at least in my part of Harry Potter, we were just a family, so we were able to play and
Yeah.
rehearse and improve. But John was able to, I mean, John does a very good trick, which is that he always, you know, leads with praise. After every take, he would say, "That's very good."
Yeah.
And Kaylee and I would go double trouble. We do to each other. We go double trouble. And he'd say, "We just do it again." And then we'd do it again. And then he'd say, "That's very good. We could just going to add something in there." And we'd add something in there. And then he'd say, "Just one more time. We're done." And then we'd do it again. He'd say, "Yeah, and we'll just do it again." So you find you've done the scene about 25 times, whilst all the time believing that the next one was going to be definitely it. And we already have it. We already have it. We're just going to go once more for fun. So he's got a very playful way of exhausting you. I was exhausted. So, you know, like all these things, very ordinary normality takes quite a lot of work. I mean, I thought he'd done very well actually with my scenes with Kaylee in the room because they are not they're not buttoned. They're not like da-da bum bum. They're just little mistakes that the grandmother keeps making. You know, she doesn't know how to say the kitchen is in there and da-da-da, but it's you know, or the doors doesn't quite close, or you know, all sorts of little accidents that when someone's nervous around a kid. And he really, you know, he worked very hard at that with us. So you know, I hope he got it. I hope the takes are in there that he wanted.
And you mentioned Kaylee there, who again I've had the pleasure of having a conversation with. She's a scarily intelligent young performer. Again, it's a simple question really, but I'm just really conscious of young performers coming into the world of acting at the moment and kind of how you see them through your eyes, because there's a huge grin on your face there where you're talking about doing scenes with her, and it seems from the outside looking in very, very joyful. I'm also really conscious, like she's been doing this for 7-8 years as well, even though she's not 20 yet. I'm just wondering how first of all how you saw working with Kaylee, how much fun that was, but also I mean you've worked with Millie Bobby Brown on Enola Holmes as well, and just how savvy the young performers coming through are.
Yeah, I mean they certainly are. I mean when I started, I was you know, I had done a degree in philosophy and then I went to RADA. I mean, I went up a ladder through the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was an entirely different profession and a different path. And actually, that was the path. You know, you had to get into the Royal Shakespeare Company and then from there to the National Theatre and then maybe. But it wasn't that film was the end result of that, but that at least you were equipped to deal with texts or situations that you'd already rehearsed, played, performed, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
These young people seem to absorb things. I suppose they've seen more film than we ever did. I mean, I wasn't allowed to watch television. I don't know. I really only understood live performing. I didn't really understand film. And they seem to, but I mean, they're very different creatures, Millie Bob Brown and Kaylee. Yeah. Kaylee's a southern, you know, from the southern states, Mississippi. Her mother's with her all the time, who's very nice, who's a nurse. They're very nice, stable family. And I suppose Kaylee's got bitten by the bug, which in my heart, I wish she wouldn't. I think she should go back to school, go back to college and get through those extraordinary precious years, not acting, which is between 17 and 21. Do something else, learn, get your brain plastic. Don't be working. But I can't persuade her to do that. I'm trying.
I mean, if I've got this right, she was about to go back to school when John Krasinski auditioned her for this as well. So it's all his fault.
She has been back at school. I mean, she's back at school for the last year. She's been at school for the last year.
I still think we can blame John for everything. I'm good with this.
We can blame John.
I think.
You know, it joined the circus, and I think that happens. They joined the circus, and it seems the velocity and the heightened life of it is very, very addictive. But it's not always good for you when you're a young person.
Yeah. Well, can I ask my profoundly dim question about the film? Because I always wonder this: was it fun
to play?
Was it fun film to make?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I am in a very particular section of that film.
Of course.
A bit like in Harry Potter, you know, I'm the frame of the film, really. I'm part of the framing of the film. So it was very, very, we had a wonderful set, which was designed beautifully. And I had a lot of say in that they had they had designed it, but I was able to move things, say the cushions were too oldie lady. I wasn't playing somebody who was a granny. I'm just playing somebody who happens to be the grandmother of a child I haven't seen for some time, but lives in New York life. I have an apartment in Chelsea. So every morning I came over the Brooklyn Bridge to work. I mean, that is itself a pleasure. You can't believe it. I can't believe I'm going over the Brooklyn Bridge. And at night, going back in the lights, going back over the bridge, back home to my little tiny apartment there. So, that's pretty privileged a stint for starters. And so I loved going to work, which was on a wonderful lot, which is down by the river. So you have that, it used to be the old Navy Yards in New York. So you have this in Brooklyn. So, it's set in Brooklyn. We were in Brooklyn. So there was a lot going for it. The steps of the house was absolutely the steps of a house. We were also in a house. And we sometimes had a studio, sometimes had a house. So it was very luxuriously done in that way. But, I wanted to play a painter. So, they got lots of paints to me, and I painted some of the paintings that are now on the wall in the show.
I was going to ask you that.
And that was great fun. But it makes you feel that you're making an indie film out of actually a very big studio film.
Interesting.
You're trying to kind of embed yourself in it in a way. And in that way, it was huge fun. What's never fun is repetition. But that is the thing that the audience must never see. We shouldn't probably even talk about, but is what we do.
Yeah. Reading the extensive list of work you've done, including some incredible drama work. The first thing I saw you on screen in, I thought you were a comedy actor. I thought you just had this natural verve for comedy. I saw you in Three Men and a Little Lady, which I don't think is a film that you've talked about it in the past, that you made that, I think, in your late 20s, and they kind of almost put you in a film where you were having to play 50s or something like that. And you've talked about how that film did no service for your film career. But I did wonder if there was a comedy bug in there, and if the comedy bug was always like deep-seated.
Well, I've always, I've never, ever seen the difference between, I have seen the difference between tragedy and comedy, but, I played a lot of those Shakespeare heroines who were very funny on the way up in my 20s. And then I did a film called My Left Foot, and then Mountains of the Moon with Bob Raveson.
Yeah.
So, having done Bob Raveson's Mountains of the Moon, and then playing Three Men and a Lady, it completely killed my heroine. I was then a goofy, mad school teacher. So that was the end of my heroine status. And I was already at the end of my 20s. So I retreated happily back to the theatre. I did not want to be just a silly school teacher on the side of many movies, of which I got sent plenty. So I kind of waited my time. I think I was very wise to do that, actually. But it's a comedy and tragedy. I played Medea, and the first half of Medea is very funny. The fights with the mother and husband, or the wife and husband, are very witty. I did Hedda Gabler, which was very funny until it wasn't.
Yeah.
So I've always felt that comedy sits absolutely in the middle. Hedda Gabler had piles of laughs in it. People laughed a lot.
I grew up with the cinema of the 1980s, and you mentioned My Left Foot there, which, if memory serves, was made with about £500,000 of Granada money and was never expected to go anywhere near a cinema, yet alone to the stage of the Oscars. And there you are in the midst of this extraordinary film. Britain was looking for its success stories at that point, and I think if my memory of growing up with British cinema in the 80s was, it was Merchant Ivory or That's Your Lot. And that's no snobbishness to Merchant Ivory, but I would have quite liked watching some other things as well. Can you capture for us being in the midst of My Left Foot, and particularly the moments where it just kind of, the realization that this was going beyond what I think the initial, at least from Granada point of view, the initial ambitions for it may have been?
Yeah, I wasn't there for the producing of it. I left My Left Foot. I commuted because I was at the Royal Shakespeare Company performing at night, and then would go back and do 3 days of My Left Foot and go away again. But my memory is that we started on a credit card, and really? Using the producer's house. There was a scene in an art gallery, and that was the producer's house. And, we then, Daniel and I were wheeled out to literally to have dinner with Granada, who then came on board. So it was started really on a wing and a prayer. But
Extraordinary.
its heart was in the right place, wasn't it? And I think
Yeah.
Jim Sheridan, he had done a lot of mad, sort of very rough theatre, I think, in New York, in a way that, our Royal Shakespeare Company thing, I was very, very, calm, unimpressed by that. But his earthiness and his commitment and what he was able to get is that he got the moments correct. He was able to play moments, cook them up and make them happen. And he did that very well, sometimes by telling us all the details, sometimes not. There's a big scene where Daniel pulls the tablecloth, and I fought terribly to keep the tablecloth on the table. I didn't know he was going to pull it off. And I think they were all a bit cross with me because I made it much harder for Daniel. But I think it made the scene better.
So what happens to you as because you talked about getting movie offers through the 1990s, and I remember like Brenda Fricker wins her Oscar and then ends up in Home Alone 2, I think it was, with lots of birds on her shoulders and straight. But what's the impact when a film like that? Is there any benefit or impact to you when a film like that suddenly becomes this, for want of a better way of putting it, this much bigger thing?
Well, I went back to the Royal Shakespeare Company after My Left Foot, and Bob Rafelson suddenly trooped in one evening with a team of people from Hollywood. So obviously, I then heard that they'd been asking to see little sections of that. At that time, they're looking for young people to turn into film stars. And so he cast me. In fact, Bob Rafelson came with a whole team of people from Hollywood. I was doing a play called Hyde Park at the very funny play by James Shirley, 18th century comedy in the Swan Theatre. He troops in, and at the interval, I saw that they'd all gone. I thought, oh, they've gone. But actually, they'd just gone to dinner. They'd seen their bit. They thought, yeah, we're having her, and they got me. I mean, I was sure I hadn't got it because they'd left the theatre, but they couldn't be bothered watching a whole play. So that's how I got. So I did get, My Left Foot resulted in Mounts on the Moon, and maybe I shouldn't have done Three Men and a Lady, but it's a very successful film. People still love it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I started this podcast by suggesting I was the heathen for not talking about theatre. Now I hear that Bob Rafelson walks out of theatre productions halfway through. But by the sounds of it, you were conscious. You knew that he was going to be in the audience for that.
Somebody must have. I mean, I didn't know who he was from Adam, except for his brilliant films. The Postman Always Rings Twice, and he was a very interesting person to know. I have to say, when we did Mounts on the Moon, I mean, he was remarkable. His confidence, and I remember always thinking he has a prairie brain. He gave me the whole autobiography of Burton and Speak, but he absolutely wasn't writing the movie to match hardly any of it. For instance, Isabel Burton married Burton, but they actually ran away together. But he put in a wedding scene, second to none. It was all that. We used to sit around the table having dinner, and I'd say the ladies are meant to leave the table, and go and sit in the drawing room. He said, "This is the first dinner where the ladies stay." I love that. That completely lack of Englishness, of following absolutely the opposite of Merchant Ivory, not playing the weird kind of Mandarin rituals of British society, but the opposite, just playing the rousing excitement for himself of it. So he was a great person to know.
You also taught there, no, not at all. You also taught there with If about how your grandmother character isn't a grandmother. That this not in the kind. I mean, if this film was being made in the 80s, the grandmother would have a stick and the teeth would be falling out, and you'd be wearing one of those hats that kind of wraps your head up a little bit. And the subversion of it just feels. Quite. But then I looked at. I'm a movie nerd, and I looked down the list of the directors you worked with in the 90s. I mean, Herbert Ross isn't mentioned an awful lot anymore. And I caught a little bit of an interview you did where you just talked, and you made Undercover Blues with him, I think it was. I mean, can you just tell? Can you tell me why? Can you tell me a bit about him?
He came to see. I'm sorry, I'm going back to my theatre life all the time, but he came to see Hedda Gabler. And Hedda Gabler had done very well, first at the Abbey Theatre, and then it went to the West End. Actually, just went around the corner to the Playhouse Theatre here. He came and saw it, and he was very taken with it. So when he was doing that film, Undercover Blues, that was called, at the time, a terrible title, Cloak and Dagger was its original. A Cloak and...
lovely.
Something, a Cloak and Nappy or something. Anyway, he cast me and Stanley Tucci, and we were the villains, and, went to Hollywood, and that was a really Hollywood film. I remember just dangling off a helicopter, thinking this is just amazing, that this is what we're doing for acting. So he used to take me out for drives along the coast, and he would talk a lot about how California used to be like the south of France, and that in the 40s that was the nicest place, because my brothers lived in the south of France, and of course it's absolutely chock-a-block with houses, and then how beautiful it was, and the same for California and Santa Monica, that it was perfection. So I used to go driving with him, and he would take me to visit various people who were old Hollywoodites. So he was very much part of my education. He had an open top car, and we'd have a bottle of water and an apple each. That's what we would. And he sort of took me under his wing. And then subsequently, when I was doing, I think my dad, he came to Ireland, but he wasn't well, and he died very shortly after that. I was very, very sad.
Yeah.
I enjoyed him very much.
Well, he just made so many really entertaining films.
Yes.
I think entertainment is a really short-changed word, but so many really entertaining films that just
and
don't
Bankrupt
seem to be
he
talked
worked with, didn't he? Yeah, he did
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful films. He was a very good film director. He used to smoke a cigarette, very thin cigarettes, and instead of saying please, he'd say please. And when he wanted to light, he'd say please. And somebody would light a cigarette. He was very old school, sat in a deck chair and, wore a gorgeous hat. And,
it was around, if I've got my timing right, you did that and Super Mario Brothers pretty much back to back.
I don't remember that being the case, but
I think
maybe.
they both came around just roughly around the same time. And I've heard you give an interview to someone else. You're pulling a slightly different face talking about Super Mario Brothers. I've noticed.
I forgot about it until you mentioned it.
Yeah. But I mean, I've heard you give an interview about how you've been asked to have a snake sleeping next to you while you were making Super Mario Brothers, and the joy of Bob Hoskins. I'm just curious on that film because, again, from us on the outside, I mean, stories have come out now about just what a difficult production that was. And I'm not trying to do tittle tattle or anything like that. I'm just more interested in the human being in the midst of it all. I know the directors struggled with it and there were problems afterwards, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're in the midst of a big production like that, I mean, how pure is it for you? How conscious are you of the ecosystem around it? Or can you just zero in on your part?
Well, I think I was a funny mix of huge ambition and sort of no ambition. I
love
was
that.
having such a wonderful time in the theatre, but I was all for being in films, and if I was going to be in those, and Roland, I turned up, and Roland Joffe summoned me to his office, and he was producing it. And I mean, he was at that time a brilliant man, beautiful, intelligent. I remember him saying a wonderful thing. He said that he had made a film in India, and the man had said, I've forgotten. He said, the man said, I don't believe in truth. I only believe in rumor. I thought it was a wonderful notion about the world, that we all only have rumors. But so he was always full of, beautiful bon mots. And I went to see Roland in his office. I didn't know him at all. And he said, Fiona, we've fallen behind on this film, and we're quite behind. So we're going to cut I want you to help me. We're going to cut some of your part. And I said, I haven't done any yet, so it's not my fault you've fallen behind. It's, I've come through the part. I think you'll find that my part's very good, and I'd like not to go. And I said, why am I being blamed for the fact the film has fallen behind? You're going to cut my part. And I remember him saying a weird phrase that I think was probably a big reprimand. He said, me friend, not enemy. I thought, well, yeah. I thought, so my part was quite cut. And then, the cast was an amazing cast, but the story, part of the problem was that it was directed by two people, Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton. And I think the problem was they literally would give you contradictory direction. So I've always shied away from double directors since. It's just very hard for authority.
Yeah, because I mean, you were on a film later that decade, the Avengers movie, and I had a chat with Jeremiah Chechnik about that. And I mean, the Avengers movie now, you're probably a slightly different face to the Avengers movie, face. I noticed.
Yeah.
But he talks about that a lot of, because again, I'm not just trying to pull in like the films that didn't do quite as well, but I just think it's quite interesting that he talked during the making of that film about it was afterwards when studio executives changed that things kind of really went awry for him on it. And again, I'm just curious what the shooting of a film like that is. It's pretty much the same question, really. That when the world around it doesn't quite go to plan. How is just the making of it. I think Eddie Izzard talked about it was just a fun film to make.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, I never felt that the two main protagonists were very comfortable in it. I mean, so now that may be a combination of the director and the actress. I mean, very good actress, you know. Rafe, wonderful actor, and they were wonderful actors. I felt the scenes, maybe it wasn't written as comic. It was kind of crudely comic, but on that film, I met Sean Connery, who was an absolutely delightful person. And he was delightful because when I met him, I was a bit daunted. You know, he was Sean Connery.
Yeah.
And he said, I hear your father played very well on the wing on the rugby. And I mean, I was so chuffed that this man had discovered that my dad, who had been a very good rugby player for Munster in Ireland,
Yeah.
he had looked up his rugby history. I mean, that's very familial. So I had a very nice time with Sean, who also behaved in a way that I'm not sure could happen now. Is that sometimes at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd be doing a scene, playing croquet or something. I was playing a character called Father, who was dressed like a man. I mean, it lacked wit, to put it mildly. There wasn't a lot of humor in any of it. It was sort of, you know, thumped, really weird. I was playing a blind person who was playing croquet, but that didn't seem to bother the film. And Sean would say things like, I think I'm going to play golf now. It's time to play golf. And they'd say, actually, Sean, we're just going to do another shot over here. And he'd say, no, I think it's my golf time. And once he'd felt he'd done enough acting in the day, he would go off and play golf. I mean, that's how powerful he was. He was amazing, Sean. He had absolutely no care. But I think maybe by then he had lost interest in the film. The other thing about that film, there are two things I remember about it, none of them to do with acting. One was that there was a basket, there was a kind of a golf net outside on a field, so they could all practice their swings, and the drivers had to drive them up to Glen Eagles. I think a lot of it was about the weekends. But the other thing was, during that film, we had an all-night shoot, and Princess Diana died, and I remember that. And the driver, we were there for each tragic announcement that evening, because I was there the whole night.
Yeah.
And I asked the driver to drive me back, and we went past Kensington Palace, and, you know, already people were putting flowers out. That would be about 5 or 6 in the morning. That was an amazing, that's one of the great, you know, one of the great memories, like the, you know, President Kennedy's death, is that night I was entirely for the whole death of Diana. But I can't remember what scene we were shooting that night.
Can I just ask you just something on the broader ecosystem of acting, because you've talked in the past about like the power of shows like Coronation Street, and I'm not testing you on it, don't worry, but I'm talking to young actors at the moment, and a lot of the ways in that they traditionally would have had, say 20, 30 years ago, repertory theatre, TV shows like The Bill and Casualty and Grange Hill, that would give them a small part and a foot in to the industry. So rep theatre isn't quite what it was for them, and that's kind of cut off. We're seeing shows cut off that would give people a foot in. Do you kind of have a view on like the kind of way into acting now and what people are coming into?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are some actors are born actors and they can do it forever from the start, and they can kind of, you know, acting is not behaviorism. It's not walking and talking. Yeah. It's what you're thinking when you're walking and talking, or what you're not thinking when you're walking and talking. But the other night I was catching up on really who I think is one of the great actors is Gary Oldman. I was just watching him in Slow Horses. And, you know, I remember Gary because I was working with his then partner, which was Leslie Manville, at the Royal Shakespeare Company. So I used to go out with Gary a lot, and he was doing a lot of plays at that time at the Royal Court. And, you know, every night he was in an Edward Bond play, I don't know, throwing stones into prams or whatever, those awful plays like Saved, doing wonderful plays like Saved. You know, if you're doing that every night for weeks on end, you're full of practice and playing the moment. Yeah. And I see in Gary, you know, this phenomenally talented, as he was then, very brave, always. I remember Gary saying, what do you want from a director? He'd say, I want inspiration. And one rarely gets it. I mean, you get guidance or help, but you don't get inspiration. But he was a very self-inspiring person. And, you know, that kind of quality of acting 30 years later comes from, I think, practice. And I do think that, I'm not sure if it makes me a better actor, but it certainly makes me know the problems that have come round and round and round, because I spent decades doing them every night. And a lot of actors don't act that much. So it's all a bit new and a wing and a prayer a little bit when they get into a new production. At least those of us who have been through the theatre have a kind of a muscle that we know how to open a text and think, what could I make with this?
Yeah.
Whilst playing it against things that you've done. So, you know, I do think that the theatre is a fantastic place to perform and to learn. And it's not the same as becoming a film star and then going to do a play. That's a different thing too, because then a production has to be built around you. That's not necessarily the same thing as you inventing the production.
That's really interesting. I mean, I remember, I think it was an interview that I think Simon Mayo quotes quite a lot, which Sean Penn talked about working with Mark Rylance. And he said, you can tell when a theatre actor's on a film set. You can straight away tell that the mechanic is different. You know that there's something there. I assume you get the same.
And it's the opposite of what people think it is. The opposite of thinking, well, they're going to act very big or not. I think is that they take very ordinary things very seriously.
Oh, I love it.
Rhythm and pause. Acting isn't whimsical, and it doesn't mean that it's constructed either. It's finding a space in your mind where you have a fair idea what this is, but you also free yourself from it. And you do exactly the same on the stage. The stage only works every night if people are genuinely free that moment, that night, not doing it the same as last night, but in the same, micro territory.
Yeah.
When we played Medea, it used to come in within about 3 seconds of itself every night. It never stretched, but it didn't mean we played it exactly the same. Sometimes it was quicker on this bit and slower on this bit. And it's that sort of like playing a symphony. The music will always expand, but will always end on that downbeat at the end.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of have that in your head.
We've got about 5 minutes left. So I was going to ask you about...
Don't get on to some good films, for goodness sake.
No, well, this has been an absolute... This has genuinely been a delight. And I was going to ask you about Terrence Malick, but I've been watching a Q&A you gave with the Oxford Union, where you talk quite a lot about your process. You talk about working with Terrence Malick and what an extraordinary time that was. I mean, that seemed very special. I wonder if I could just ask you quickly about working with Terrence Malick and what memories you hold, and then try and sneak in Brian De Palma at the end, because I've just not heard you talk about working with him as well.
Well, maybe they're both not dissimilar. They're similar age group, aren't they? And I mean, Terrence, he does that very familial thing of saying, just come and join us. And he had asked me, and he said, I'd like you to be in my film. He left me a voice message. I was in Washington doing a play, and he said, I'd like you to. And I said, well, I'd like to meet you. I didn't want to do it just, I didn't really want to just do a film with somebody having not met them. So he came to New York and we had breakfast, and he said, what do you have for breakfast? I said, I have an omelette. He said, I think I'll have an omelette too. He's the most beautiful, simple person you could meet. And then I went down to Smithville and we made it very familiarly. He would shoot all night, just keep the camera rolling while the young kids played around, and snakes would come out from under a rock and he'd follow the snake, follow the kids. So he makes things like poems, and then he would make it. And I think he shot maybe he shot 1,000 hours of film. And for a long time, the producer would ring me up and say, you're really a leading character in that film. He's really kept you in. And then in the last 6 weeks, he gets rid of these. So each of us were really just caryatids holding this film up, and then he just takes you away and leaves what he needs. And that's the person, so it's more rewarding to work with him than it is necessarily to be in his films, but a wonderful genius. And I loved Brian De Palma because he's very grumpy and very kind of uncharming in the best sense, because you feel you're with a real person, and I one night there was one bit where a man was having his head, kind of cut off. I said, does this stuff still bother you? He said, are you kidding me? I've been doing this since 1962. I mean, he just does horror and torture without any, he hasn't got the excitement that John Krasinski has about making a scene happen. He just does it, he just does it like it's homework.
And you've shot a film, I do want to quickly name check this, with Rebecca Lenkovitz. I believe I pronounced her name right, by the name of Hot Milk. And I thought her script for She Said was great, and how that film just didn't get noticed much at all still
Well, it
baffles the
hasn't
life out of
happened.
me.
It hasn't happened.
She said, no, sorry, the one she did before, she said the script that she wrote for that. So can you tell us anything about Hot Milk and just tease that a little bit?
That's the most exciting question you've asked me. That was made over 3 years.
Excellent. I got there at the end.
They were trying to get the money up to make it. And finally, it was made. It's set in Spain, but it's actually we shot in Greece last summer. And Rebecca had written it and then directed it beautifully. And so we spent all of July and August. Emma Mackey played the daughter, I played the mother. And it's about a woman who has a kind of a psychosomatic illness where she won't walk. And so the daughter has to wheel her around. And Vicky Creeps played the girl who they meet, who the young girl meets there. So it was a beautiful film. And I went to see it about 2 weeks ago and I was knocked for six because she's edited it really brilliantly. And that I hope will go to Venice or Berlin or somewhere like that in the next few months. And then I'm really hoping it'll have an impact. She's a very, very good writer, Rebecca, and a beautiful director. So that was a highlight for me last year, I have to say, of my work.
I love that. And I hope when that film comes around, our paths cross again. This has been a real delight. Fiona Shaw CBE, I got one good question to you and no terrible one. So I'm going to take that as my high score for the year.
Simon, it's been lovely talking, but you brought up some nightmares there.
Oh, I do apologise. Huge congratulations on If, though. And they're not nightmares. They're just lovely human stories. That's how I see it.
Yes, they are.
Genuinely, that's how I see it. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Good luck today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And that was my conversation with Fiona Shaw. The film If is in UK cinemas, in fact it's in cinemas around the world, just as this podcast is being released into the world. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. You can find more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. More from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories, also on Twitter and Blue Sky. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. You can find us on Instagram, Film Stories Magazine UK. You can find us on Patreon too, at patreon.com/Simon Brew. Our online shop, store.filmstories.co.uk, has loads of our print magazines, including our brand new William Shatner headlined issue 50. Film Junior is on there as well. And our website is filmstories.co.uk. I think that's enough though, isn't it? I've outstayed my welcome as usual. All it leaves me to say is the main thing is you all stay well, you all stay safe. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care, look after yourselves, and bye-bye.